Welcome to a journey into history's greatest betrayals. If you're passionate about uncovering untold stories from the past, hit subscribe and join us for cinematic history like you've never seen before. The flicker of torchlight stretched across the ancient walls of Constantinople, shadows dancing like ghosts of the empire's past. The year was 1916, and though the Ottoman Empire still bore the grandeur of 6 centuries, its heart beat with exhaustion. The Great War had drained its armies, its people, and its faith. But no one, neither soldier nor sultan, knew that the blow destined to cripple the empire would not come from foreign cannons. It would come from betrayal. Imagine standing in the corridors of Topkapi Palace on a cold January night. The sultan's advisors whisper in corners, their faces pale, their voices trembling. News has arrived from the Arabian desert. Rumors of rebellion, of desert tribes once loyal now turning against the empire. But this was not just rebellion. It was treachery born of promises written in secret ink, carried across seas by spies and diplomats. Far away, in the golden sands of the Hejaz, Emir Faisal sat in his tent under a moonlit sky. A letter lay open before him, signed not by his Ottoman overlords but by British hands. Promises of independence of a free Arab nation glittered like stars in his imagination. And yet Faisal's heart was torn. For centuries his people had prayed in mosques built under Ottoman rule, fought in their armies, and lived under the crescent flag. To rise against the empire was unthinkable, yet to ignore the chance of freedom was unforgivable. Meanwhile, in the trenches of Gallipoli and Mesopotamia, weary Ottoman soldiers fought with their last strength. They believed they were defending the caliphate itself, the holy protector of Islam. None knew that in distant deserts, their supposed allies were preparing to turn against them. None knew that an English officer named T.E. Lawrence had begun weaving his web, whispering promises, fueling discontent, and lighting sparks that would soon become a firestorm. On the palace balcony, the Sultan gazed out over the Bosphorus, ships drifting like phantoms in the dark waters. He sensed a storm gathering, though its thunder was still beyond the horizon. The empire had survived crusades, Mongol invasions, and centuries of war, but this storm was different. This storm was treachery, dressed in the robes of friendship. As the call to prayer echoed across the city, blending with the sigh of the sea winds, a messenger arrived at the palace gates. In his hands he carried a sealed report. Inside was the first undeniable proof that trusted Arab allies were no longer allies at all. The Sultan's hand trembled as he broke the seal. His eyes widened. His lips whispered a single word heavy with grief: betrayal. And with that word, the slow unraveling of the Ottoman Empire had begun. The desert was alive with silence. No sound but the hiss of wind over dunes and the soft groan of camels marching through an endless sea of gold. Beneath a star-scattered sky, Emir Faisal's caravan pressed deeper into the Hejaz, his heart heavier with each mile. He carried within him a choice that would shape not only his people's future but the very survival of the Ottoman Empire. Around his fire, tribesmen gathered, their faces lit by flames, eyes glowing with both loyalty and doubt. They had served under Ottoman banners, bled for Ottoman wars. But now whispers carried by British envoys stirred their imagination. An Arab nation, free from Istanbul's chains, an empire of your own. The words were honeyed, yet poisoned. Among them sat a foreigner, pale, sharp-eyed, dressed in Bedouin robes that never seemed to fit. His name was Thomas Edward Lawrence, though the Arabs called him Orange. He listened more than he spoke, but when he did, his words pierced like blades. "The Turks see you as pawns," he told them, voice low, steady, persuasive. "But the British, we see you as brothers. Stand with us, and the empire you dream of can be yours." Faisal studied him carefully. Lawrence's sincerity felt real, almost unsettlingly so. But in the shadows, another truth lingered. Promises inked in London's offices were already being carved apart in secret. Agreements with France. The Arabs would be used, not freed. Yet Faisal, caught between loyalty to Istanbul and hope for his people, leaned closer to the fire, his silence mistaken for consent. Back in Damascus, Ottoman officers tightened their grip. Patrols doubled. Suspicion thickened like smoke. Spies were everywhere. One night, an Arab officer loyal to the Sultan intercepted a message smuggled across the desert. Its words were treason in ink, plans of revolt coded with names, dates, promises of gold and guns supplied by the British. He brought the letter to his commander, hands shaking. "Pasha," he whispered, "they are preparing to rise." The commander's jaw clenched. He had fought alongside Arab comrades for years, shared rations, buried brothers together. The thought of betrayal gnawed at him, but the evidence was clear. Meanwhile, Lawrence rode deeper into the sands, blending into tribes who began to see him not as a stranger, but as a prophet of destiny. Every mile, every whispered promise, pulled the Arabs further from Istanbul and closer to the point of no return. And Faisal? That night, as the fire crackled and the desert stars burned above, he finally spoke. "If freedom requires turning against the Ottomans," he said softly, "then so be it. My people must rise." The men cheered. Lawrence smiled. And far away in Constantinople, the betrayal tightened its grip. The steel rails of the Hejaz Railway gleamed beneath the desert sun, stretching like a lifeline from Damascus to Medina. For the Ottoman Empire, it was more than a railway. It was the empire's artery, pumping soldiers, supplies, and faith across the vast desert. To the Sultan, it symbolized unity. To the rebels, it was a chain that bound them. The first explosions came before dawn. A thunderous roar ripped through the silence, shaking the sand like an earthquake. Flames swallowed wooden carriages. Twisted iron screamed and smoke billowed into the sky. Ottoman soldiers stumbled from their bunks, rifles clutched, eyes wide with terror. From the dunes, tribesmen in flowing robes stormed forward, rifles flashing in the half-light. Among them rode Faisal's men, their cries fierce, their loyalty no longer to the Sultan in Istanbul, but to the promise of independence. And at their side, directing with uncanny precision, was Lawrence. He studied the blasts, the ambushes, the speed of the desert raids, not as a soldier of Britain alone, but as a man intoxicated by the romance of rebellion. An Ottoman sergeant, Mustafa, crawled from the wreckage of a derailed train. His ears rang, his arm burned with shrapnel. Around him, comrades screamed for help, some buried beneath iron, others bleeding into the sand. He staggered to his feet, clutching his rifle, eyes fixed on the figures charging through the smoke. He recognized them, Arabs he had once shared bread with, men who had marched beside him only months before. "Brothers!" he shouted hoarsely, his voice cracking with desperation. Why are you doing this?" But his cry was drowned by gunfire. For the Ottomans, the Hejaz Railway was life. For the rebels, it became their first great symbol of defiance. Blowing it apart was not just war. It was betrayal made visible in fire and steel. News of the attack reached Constantinople within days. The Sultan's court erupted in outrage. "They bite the hand that fed them," one vizier spat, slamming his fist on the marble table. "Traitors!" But rage was powerless against reality. The empire's grip was slipping, its faith in loyalty unraveling. That night, Mustafa and a handful of survivors limped into Medina, their faces blackened with soot, their spirits broken. The city's garrison received them in silence, eyes filled with fear of what was coming. The betrayal was no longer a whisper in the desert. It was war. And yet, as Lawrence watched the flames consume another Ottoman train from a ridge above, his blue eyes narrowed. He knew this was only the beginning. Because the empire would not collapse in silence, it would shatter in screams. The desert sun scorched the ancient city of Medina, its holy minarets shimmering in waves of heat. Within its walls, Ottoman banners still flew proudly, guarded by one of the empire's most loyal soldiers, Fakhri Pasha, a commander whose name would soon be etched into legend. When news reached him that Arab tribes had turned against the empire, Fakhri's face hardened. His men urged caution. Supplies were dwindling, the enemy was everywhere, and British gold flowed like water through the desert. But Fakhri stood firm. "Medina," he declared, his voice echoing through the barracks, "is not just a city. It is a trust, a sacred jewel of Islam. As long as I draw breath, it will not fall." Outside the walls, the rebels gathered like a tightening noose. Faisal's forces, guided by Lawrence, launched ambushes on supply caravans, tore apart the Hejaz Railway, and starved the city into desperation. Months turned into years. Inside Medina, hunger gnawed at soldiers and civilians alike. Bread grew scarce, water rationed, disease spread, yet Fakhri refused to surrender. Among his troops was Mustafa, the sergeant who had survived the railway ambush. His body bore scars, but his spirit still clung to loyalty. He wrote letters to his family in Anatolia, though most never reached them. In the quiet of night, he confessed to comrades his confusion, his grief at fighting men he once called brothers. Meanwhile, in Faisal's camp, the mood shifted. Victories around the railway fed confidence, but Medina stood unbroken. At the fire one night, Lawrence spoke with a mix of admiration and cold calculation. "Fakhri Pasha fights like a lion," he admitted, gazing toward the distant city lights. "But even lions die when the desert starves them." Faisal's men cheered. Yet Faisal himself sat in silence, his heart heavy. He had chosen this path, betrayal for freedom. But the sight of Medina resisting, defiant and unyielding, gnawed at him. Were they liberators, or had they become pawns in another empire's game? Inside the city, starvation pushed men to the edge. Horses were slaughtered, leather boiled for soup. Yet still Fakhri rallied his troops for prayers each dawn, his voice thunderous. "Hold fast! You guard the holy city, and God himself witnesses your struggle." The rebels tightened their grip, but Medina did not fall. Month after month, year after year, it endured, becoming a symbol of the empire's stubborn refusal to die. And yet, even as the banners of the Ottomans fluttered over Medina, cracks widened elsewhere. Damascus stirred with unrest. Aleppo whispered of rebellion. The empire was bleeding from within, even as one city refused to bow. The desert war had become a siege of souls. And soon betrayal would strike at the very heart of Damascus itself. The streets of Damascus pulsed with unease. Once the proud jewel of the empire's Arab provinces, its bustling markets and fragrant gardens now carried whispers of rebellion. Beneath the sound of merchants shouting prices and the clip of hooves on cobblestone, rumors spread like wildfire. Rumors that the Arabs were no longer Ottomans, but something else entirely. In a dimly lit cafe near the Umayyad Mosque, men leaned close over steaming cups of coffee. Their voices dropped to conspiratorial tones. "The Ottomans are weak," one hissed. "Faisal's army grows stronger every day. Soon Damascus will be ours." Another, older and more cautious, shook his head. "Be careful. The Sultan's spies are everywhere. One careless word, and you'll swing from the gallows." And indeed, the spies were listening. Ottoman agents in plain clothes haunted the markets, ears sharp for treachery. Files thickened with names, families marked for punishment. Yet for every traitor exposed, two more rose in the shadows. Inside the Ottoman barracks, tension strangled the air. Arab soldiers who had once marched under the crescent banner now faced suspicion from their Turkish officers. Loyalty was no longer assumed. It was tested, doubted, distrusted. Mustafa, still loyal despite his doubts, watched as comrades whispered in corners, their eyes darting nervously. He felt the weight of betrayal creeping even into the ranks. Then one night the truth bared its teeth. A caravan entered Damascus under moonlight, its crates marked as dates and grain. But hidden within were rifles, British rifles destined not for Ottoman soldiers but for the rebels waiting in the hills. The weapons were discovered by accident. A Turkish officer, suspicious of the cargo, ordered an inspection. When the crates split open, steel glinted beneath the torchlight. A hush fell over the courtyard. Then rage. The officer dragged the Arab merchants before the city gates, their pleas drowned by the gathering crowd. "Traitors," he shouted, "selling our empire for foreign gold." The punishment was swift and brutal, meant as a warning. Yet instead of quelling unrest, it fanned the flames. Mothers wept, sons clenched their fists, and in the silence after, Damascus itself seemed to hold its breath. Faisal, miles away in his desert camp, received word of the executions. His jaw tightened, his heart torn. He had chosen rebellion, but now blood stained the streets of his people. Lawrence placed a hand on his shoulder, his voice steady. "Every empire dies in fire. You cannot hesitate now." Damascus teetered between loyalty and revolt. And soon the city would be the stage where betrayal turned into full rebellion. The shadows were gathering, and the Ottomans could no longer tell friend from foe. The dawn broke over Damascus with the call to prayer echoing from the minarets. But beneath the city's beauty lay a storm ready to burst. In the narrow alleys, rebels slipped through the crowds, their rifles hidden beneath cloaks. In secret rooms above tea houses, messages from Faisal arrived in hurried script. The time has come, rise. For weeks, tension had coiled tighter with every execution, every rumor of betrayal. Arab officers inside the Ottoman garrison wrestled with their conscience. Some still saluted the crescent banner, but others had quietly pledged themselves to the dream of independence. One spark would ignite the powder keg. That spark came when an Ottoman patrol clashed with rebels, smuggling rifles through Bab al-Saghir Gate. Shots rang out, echoing through the ancient walls. Within moments, the city exploded into chaos. From the rooftops, rebels fired down on soldiers scrambling through the streets. Market stalls overturned, spices spilling into blood-stained cobblestones. The air reeked of smoke, sweat, and fear. Civilians fled into their homes, slamming doors, while others peered through shutters, watching history unravel before their eyes. Inside the barracks, Mustafa gripped his rifle with trembling hands. He had sworn loyalty to the empire. Yet now, as the city he loved burned, he saw faces he recognized among the rebels, neighbors, childhood friends, even a cousin. His heart twisted with conflict. Was he defending his empire, or fighting against his own blood? The Ottoman commanders ordered a brutal crackdown. Artillery thundered from the citadel, shells ripping through the old quarters. Houses collapsed in showers of dust. The screams of the innocent rose with the smoke. But with every volley, hatred deepened. The people no longer saw the empire as protector, but as oppressor. In the chaos, Lawrence slipped into the city disguised once more in Bedouin robes. Moving through alleys thick with gunpowder smoke, he sought out rebel leaders. "Hold fast," he urged them. "The British stand with you. Soon the Ottomans will crumble." His words, a mix of promise and deception, burned in their ears like prophecy. By nightfall, Damascus lay half in ruins. Fires painted the skyline red, the once proud capital trembling under its own betrayal. In the governor's palace, Ottoman officials argued, some urging retreat, others swearing to fight to the last. But one truth could no longer be denied. The city was slipping from their grasp. As Mustafa stood guard on the palace steps, his rifle heavy, his soul torn, he whispered to himself, "Brother against brother. This is how empires die." And though the flames of Damascus lit the sky, darker storms gathered on the horizon, storms that would sweep the Ottomans from Arabia altogether. The revolt spread like wildfire. What began in whispers in Damascus now roared across the desert, igniting tribes from the Red Sea to the mountains of Syria. Ottoman outposts, once symbols of imperial authority, became targets for sudden raids. The empire's crescent banners were torn down, replaced by the new flag of revolt, black, white, green, and red, fluttering defiantly in the desert wind. Caravans once loyal to Istanbul now carried ammunition to rebels. The Hejaz Railway, once a lifeline, lay in ruins, rails twisted, bridges blown apart. Each explosion tore another vein from the empire's heart. And at the center of this storm, moving with uncanny agility between tribes and battlefields, was Faisal, his voice steady, his gaze burning with both determination and sorrow. But Faisal was not alone. By his side rode Lawrence, now fully immersed in the rebellion. His foreign face no longer drew suspicion. He had become a brother to the tribes, a symbol of British support, though his letters back to London revealed the truth. Promises made to the Arabs were never meant to be kept. He knew it, yet still he pushed them forward, driven by both strategy and a strange loyalty to Faisal himself. One night under the desert stars, Faisal gathered his men. Around the campfire, warriors leaned in, their eyes reflecting the flames. "For centuries," Faisal said, his voice heavy, "we have shed blood for the Ottomans, but they no longer see us as brothers. They see us as subjects. Tonight we rise not against Islam, but against oppression. We rise for freedom." Cheers erupted, rifles raised skyward, yet behind the celebration lingered a shadow. Mustafa, captured in a skirmish near the railway, was dragged before the rebels. His uniform torn, his face bruised, he still carried himself with dignity. "Who fight against your own?" a rebel sneered. Mustafa's voice cracked but held firm. "I fight for loyalty, for the empire that gave us unity. You think the British will grant you freedom? No, they will chain you anew." His words pierced Faisal, though the emir said nothing. The rebels argued whether to execute the prisoner, but Faisal raised his hand. "Spare him. His blood is not ours to take. Mustafa was thrown back into the desert night, alive but broken, his faith in his comrades shattered beyond repair. The uprising gained strength, but with it came a bitter truth. Every victory against the Ottomans deepened the Arabs' dependence on British promises, and in London and Paris, pens scratched across secret maps, carving Arab lands into future colonies. The Arabs fought for freedom, the British fought for empire, and the Ottomans. They bled, watching their dominion crumble grain by grain, city by city, far from the deserts where men bled and died. In the polished halls of Europe, another war was being fought, not with rifles or dynamite, but with pens, ink, and whispered deals. While Faisal's warriors charged Ottoman trains and Lawrence blew up bridges, diplomats in London and Paris quietly sketched the death sentence of Arab dreams. It was called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. In a smoke-filled room, Sir Mark Sykes of Britain leaned over a map stretched across a mahogany table. Across from him sat François-Georges Picot of France, his finger tracing lines over lands he had never walked. Syria, Mesopotamia, Palestine, the ancient heartlands of the Arabs, were carved up like spoils of war. Britain would take Iraq and Palestine. France would take Syria and Lebanon. The Arabs, promised freedom, would be left with scraps, their loyalty repaid with betrayal. And the Ottomans. Their empire was already being divided before it had even fallen. In the desert, Faisal knew nothing of this. Each letter from British officials spoke of liberty, of a great Arab kingdom stretching from the Red Sea to Damascus. Lawrence himself, though aware of Sykes-Picot, concealed the truth from his friend. In his private writings, he confessed the torment. "I risk losing my honor if I tell them, yet I risk my soul if I do not." Meanwhile, in Damascus, Mustafa wandered the ruined streets, now patrolled by rebels. His empire's banners were gone, replaced with a new flag he did not recognize. He thought of the Sultan in distant Constantinople, of the soldiers starving in Medina, of the brothers lost in Gallipoli. All of it, centuries of struggle, was unraveling not only from the sword, but from treachery unseen. Back in Europe, Sykes raised his glass. "The East," he said with smug certainty, "will not belong to the Turks, nor the Arabs. It will belong to us." Picot smiled. The ink dried, and with it, the fate of millions was sealed. But betrayal cannot remain hidden forever. Rumors began to seep into the desert camps. Some tribesmen whispered of French officers already moving into Syria, of British troops laying claims to Palestine. Faisal dismissed them as enemy lies, but doubt flickered in his eyes. And then, a courier arrived at Faisal's tent with a scrap of paper, smuggled from Cairo. On it were words that froze his blood. "The British and French have divided our lands. Independence is a mirage." He clenched the letter in his fist, rage and disbelief battling in his chest. Had he traded one master for another? The fire of rebellion still burned, but now its smoke carried the bitter stench of betrayal far deeper than he had ever feared. Damascus, 1918. The Ottomans were retreating, their banners torn, their armies fractured. After centuries of dominance, the empire's grip on the Arab world was collapsing. When Faisal rode into the city, the people greeted him as a liberator. Flags of the revolt waved from rooftops. Drums thundered and voices cried, "Long live the Arab kingdom." For a fleeting moment it felt real. The betrayal, the blood, the hunger, perhaps it had all been worth it. At last, an Arab nation free of foreign rule. Faisal walked through the streets with Lawrence at his side. Both men cloaked in dust and exhaustion, yet lifted by hope. But shadows moved behind the celebrations. British officials soon arrived, not as allies but as masters. They carried papers, contracts, orders, not freedom. They spoke of mandates, of protective administration. France demanded its share of Syria. Britain claimed Palestine and Iraq. The words were wrapped in diplomacy. But the truth was clear. The Arabs had been used. One evening in the governor's palace, Faisal confronted General Allenby, the British commander. His voice, once steady, trembled with fury. "You promised us freedom. You swore the empire would be ours. Was that oath nothing but dust?" Allenby's face remained cold. "The realities of war, Your Highness. Agreements had to be made." Faisal's hands clenched. Behind his eyes burned not just anger, but despair, for he had led his people into a war not for liberty, but for another master's chains. In the streets, Mustafa watched the new occupiers march through Damascus. He had lost comrades to Arab bullets, survived the starvation of Medina, and now stood among a people cheering for a freedom that would never come. His voice broke in a whisper, words carried away by the wind. We were betrayed. All of us. Even Lawrence felt the weight of guilt crushing his chest. He had fought alongside the Arabs, shared their dangers, their victories, their dreams. Yet he knew more than anyone that those dreams were already being erased on European maps. In his journal he wrote, "I have sold them lies and they trusted me." Faisal's victory in Damascus was hollow. The palace that should have been his throne became a waiting room for foreign diplomats. The cheers in the streets began to fade, replaced by suspicion, arguments and disappointment. The Ottoman Empire lay shattered, but in its place did not rise the Arab nation Faisal had dreamed of. Instead, the soil of Syria and Palestine grew heavy with new flags, British, French, foreign. The betrayal was complete, and yet the final blow still loomed. For the world would soon gather in Paris, and in those gilded halls, the fate of nations would be decided. The war was over. Europe's cities, scarred by years of blood and fire, now echoed with the voices of victors. In 1919, the great powers gathered in Paris to decide the fate of the fallen empires. To the victors, it was a celebration of triumph. To the Ottomans, broken and humiliated, it was the final carving of their corpse. And to the Arabs, it was the moment that would test whether sacrifice had meaning or was nothing but ashes. Prince Faisal arrived in Paris with hope burning stubbornly in his chest. Dressed in flowing white robes and golden headdress, he walked through the marble corridors of Versailles like a symbol of a new dawn. Beside him was Lawrence, dressed not as a soldier now, but as an uneasy shadow. Together they carried the dream of an Arab kingdom, won not just by rebellion, but by faith in British promises. The conference rooms glittered with chandeliers, polished floors reflecting the faces of Europe's most powerful men. Wilson of America preached self-determination. Lloyd George of Britain whispered of strategy. Clemenceau of France growled of spoils. Maps sprawled across the tables, lines, borders, colors, ink carving destiny. When Faisal spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. My people rose against the Ottomans, believing in freedom. They bled, they died, and they believed the world would honor their sacrifice. Do not replace one empire with another. Grant us what was promised, an Arab nation. For a moment the hall was silent. Even hardened diplomats felt the sincerity in his words. Lawrence, standing at the edge of the room, lowered his eyes, unable to meet Faisal's gaze. Then came the reply, cool, measured, final. Clemenceau tapped the map with his finger. Syria belongs to France. Lloyd George followed, his tone apologetic but firm. Palestine shall be placed under British mandate. Mesopotamia, too. The words struck like daggers. Faisal's lips trembled, his fists clenched. Mandate? You promised independence. Wilson looked away. Clemenceau smirked. Lloyd George sighed. And Lawrence, his heart heavy with shame, said nothing. In that moment, Faisal understood. The rebellion, the sacrifices, the dreams, it had all been a mirage painted by empires. The Arabs had not overthrown chains. They had exchanged them. When he left the hall, his steps were heavy. Outside, reporters shouted questions, but Faisal's answer was silence. He mounted his horse and rode away, a prince draped not in triumph but betrayal. And so the Ottoman Empire was shattered, not only by war but by treachery. Its ruins fed the hunger of new empires, while the Arabs who dreamed of freedom awoke to find themselves trapped once again. The betrayal was complete, and its echoes still haunt the Middle East today.